So when we're asking any question of the Bible, such as what makes for a holy marriage or intimate relationship, we want to keep in mind, what is the whole story of the Bible about? Now there are a number of ways that you could phrase the story of the whole Bible is telling. Some of the phrases that I think are helpful are salvation. The Bible tells the story of the salvation of God's people, the salvation of the whole cosmos. The Bible tells the story of new creation. The creation that was ruined in the garden, God is desperately at work to try and make all things new. We might say that the Bible is a story of liberation. Liberation and love. You could come up with a lot of your own ideas about the way that you want to say this is what the whole story of the Bible is about. What is this diagram I have here? I know it looks a little bit like an upside down tree, but this is actually a river. It's meant to be a river, kind of seen from a bird's eye view, with many streams and tributaries flowing into the river. Now, every single passage of the Bible is a tributary that contributes to the whole big picture of the Bible. And so we were just talking about the many different models of marriage that we have in the Bible. So we'll list some of those up here. We have Adam and Eve, which is a story about partnership. It also becomes a story of subordination. It also becomes a story of shame. We have stories of rape. We have stories of polygamy. We also have stories of couples that were there to build up the church. We have the story of Mary and Joseph taking care of each other as a refugee family with Jesus when Herod was launched an infanticide. So we have refugees, we have care, we have self-sacrifice. We have many, many tributaries in the Bible that all play a role in leading toward the big story that the Bible is telling. So if you think of the way that the river flows in one direction, we're saying that this river of the Bible is flowing in this direction. Now, we already know that some of these ideas of marriage in the Bible have already been rejected, not only by the church, but also by the Jewish interpreters of these very scriptures. So how did they get there? How is it that we have decided that some of these tributaries do not anymore affect how we practice marriage today? Well, that's the work of ethics. The work of ethics is figuring out what is right and what is wrong. The Bible and all of its tributaries play a role in those ethics. But there are certain ethical lenses that we use, interpretive questions, that help us do this work. Now, as Christian interpreters of Scripture, the most important lens that we have is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So right here, where kind of all the streams combine, I'm going to draw a cross. This cross represents the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So when we're reading Scripture, any Scripture, we're always reading through this lens. But there are some other ethical questions for interpretation that the Bible gives to us. For example, in the early church, one of the questions was, does this edify the church? Does this build up the church? This comes to us in 1 Corinthians 8, the question about, is it okay for followers of Jesus to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? Paul essentially says, look, we know that idols aren't real, but if you eating food that has been sacrificed to idols causes your brother or sister to stumble, then it's not a good idea. So ultimately, the question is, does it build up the church? Another ethical lens or interpretive question we can ask comes from Mark 3, the story of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. Now, in Jewish law and tradition, it is not allowed to do work on the Sabbath. So when Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, the Pharisees ask him questions. Jesus asks them a question in return. Is it lawful to give life on the Sabbath? So I think that could be an ethical question for us. Does this give life? One of the biggest narratives that we have in the Old Testament is the story of Exodus, the story of the delivery of God's people from slavery in Egypt into the Promised Land. It is a story of liberation. So I think one of the big ethical questions we can ask of anything is this liberation? Is there liberation and love in this? Does this liberate the people of God? In Genesis 1, in the very beginning, when God built this beautiful world, God created humankind in the image of God. So one of the ethical questions we can ask is, does this honor the image of God in all people? You could come up with some other interpretive lenses or questions yourselves. For Methodists, whose rules are do good, do no harm, and attend the ordinances, we might ask the question, does this do good? Does this do harm? But of course, most importantly, we have the cross here, which asks this question, is this cruciform? Does it model the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? So, when we're reading the Bible, we always read with the flow of the river. We are reading toward the overarching theme of the whole Bible, and as we do that, we're taking every individual tributary and we're reading it through these questions. So we might look at something like rape in the Old Testament and ask the question, does this give life? Does this liberate the people of God? And we might say, no, this doesn't liberate the people of God. And so as a church today, we no longer practice what the Bible taught about what to do in marrying your rape victim. So I want to suggest to you that as we ask this question, what makes for a holy marriage or intimate relationship today, we look at all the tributaries in the Bible, but we make sure to read them forward. I want to give you a quick example of reading backward. Question of slavery. It can be very easy for someone to find the passage in Scripture that says, slaves, obey their masters. If you just look at the one tributary that says, slaves, obey your masters, and you don't do this work, does it liberate the people of God? Then you will stick here. You're essentially reading upstream instead of downstream. This is also sometimes called proof texting. It does not take into consideration the whole flow of the Bible.